8 earthquakes. One day, June 14, 2026, southern Missouri. The ground beneath 12 million people is not stable, but the fault that once rang church bells in Boston from 1,500 kilometers away is not waiting for anyone to notice. It is still loading. The New Madrid seismic zone never stopped. It has been loading for 2 centuries. The USGS puts a 25 to 40% probability of a magnitude 6.0 or greater event within any 50-year window on a fault system, running 320 kilometers through Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Illinois. That is not a historical footnote. It is the current operating condition of the most seismically active region east of the Rocky Mountains. To understand why this fault behaves the way it does, you need to understand something that breaks every intuition most people carry about earthquakes. Most earthquakes happen at the edges of tectonic plates. The Pacific coast of North America is a classic example. The Juan de Fuca plate grinds beneath the North American plate off Washington and Oregon. The San Andreas Fault marks where the Pacific plate slides past North America. The mechanics are visible, mappable, and in some sense expected. You live near a plate boundary, you expect earthquakes. New Madrid destroys that model entirely. If you'd asked anyone in St. Louis about intraplate faulting back in 1810, they would have told you the ground here was solid. Stable. Old. The kind of bedrock continent that does not move. They were wrong, and the fault knew it. The New Madrid seismic zone is what geologists call an intraplate fault system. The ruptures here do not occur at the edge of a plate. They occur in the interior of the North American plate, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest plate boundary. That single fact has enormous consequences, and most of them are bad. And then the Reelfoot Rift made the one structural decision that changed everything. It failed to complete. The structural engine beneath New Madrid is the Reelfoot Rift. This is a failed continental rift, a zone where the North American continent began pulling itself apart roughly 500 million years ago, then stopped. The rifting never completed, but the scar remained, buried beneath kilometers of sediment, invisible at the surface and mechanically distinct from the surrounding crust. The faults defining the New Madrid seismic zone are the reactivated edges of that ancient rift structure. They are not new faults. They are among the oldest structural features on the continent, and they are still accumulating stress. The loading mechanism is the slow westward motion of the North American plate itself. Stress concentrates along any zone of mechanical weakness, including ancient rift boundaries. Stress builds on the fault plains over centuries with no modern surface expression. No volcanoes, no mountain ranges rising, no landscape signal that anything is happening below. In the coming decades, the region would understand exactly what this meant. Cold, rigid crust transmits seismic energy with extraordinary efficiency. When an earthquake ruptures in warm, fractured crust near a plate boundary like California, the energy attenuates relatively quickly. A magnitude 6.0 in the Los Angeles basin typically causes strong shaking within perhaps 50 to 80 kilometers. The cold, intact crust of the continental interior behaves like a tuning fork by comparison. Seismic waves travel farther, lose less energy, and arrive at distant locations with far more force. The USGS has estimated that a magnitude 6.0 in the New Madrid seismic zone would shake an area approximately 10 times larger than a comparable West Coast event. That is not a rounding error. That is a fundamental difference in wave propagation physics inside cold, rigid lithosphere. The continent's most dangerous interior fault system is also the one with the fewest surface clues that anything is wrong. No subduction, no volcanic heat, no visible fault scarp cutting through the landscape. The New Madrid seismic zone is, in a structural sense, the most dangerous thing you cannot see. The zone runs roughly 320 kilometers through Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Illinois. It is the most seismically active region east of the Rocky Mountains. Hundreds of micro-earthquakes occur every year, the vast majority too small to feel. The fault is not dormant, it is breathing. The winter of 1811 was cold across the American frontier. The Mississippi River Valley was sparsely settled. European American communities were small. Indigenous nations had inhabited the region for millennia and knew the land intimately. What none of them could have prepared for was what the ground beneath them was about to do. At approximately 2, 15 inches the morning on December 16, 1811, the first main shock struck. The estimated magnitude was 7.5 to 7.9. The epicenter was in the area of what is now New Madrid, Missouri. At that moment, the town had fewer than 1,000 residents. The shaking was violent enough to throw people from their beds. Trees snapped. The ground cracked open in long fissures. Sand and water erupted from the earth in columns. The Mississippi River churned. This was not a single event. It was the opening act of the most powerful earthquake sequence in the recorded history of the contiguous United States. Over the following weeks, aftershocks came continuously. Some were large enough to be main shocks in their own right. The sequence did not pause. It did not diminish quickly. It kept going. On January 23, 1812, the second major main shock struck. The estimated magnitude was 7.3 to 7.5. Again, the epicenter was in the New Madrid region. Again, the ground shook violently across a vast area. Boats on the Mississippi were thrown about. Banks collapsed into the water. Islands that had existed for generations disappeared beneath the surface. And then came February 7, 1812. The third and largest main shock struck at approximately 3.45 inches the morning. The estimated magnitude range is 7.7 to 8.0. Eyewitness accounts describe the ground rolling in visible waves, like water. Trees snapped at the root. The smell of sulfur rose from newly opened fissures. People who were awake described a roaring sound preceding the shaking, like distant thunder moving toward them at speed. The Mississippi River at New Madrid appeared to reverse its surface flow. This is the detail that has followed this event through 2 centuries of documentation. The river did not actually reverse its permanent course. What happened was a combination of massive bank collapses upstream, sending walls of water southward, while the riverbed itself was deformed by fault movement, creating a temporary hydraulic reversal of the surface current. Boats moored on the bank were thrown into the current. Some were carried upstream. The river, for several hours, was doing something that rivers are not supposed to do. The land subsidence created during this sequence permanently altered the landscape of western Tennessee. A low-lying area near the Tennessee-Kentucky border sank several meters. Water from the Mississippi and surrounding wetlands filled the depression. The result is Reelfoot Lake, a 15,000-acre body of water that still exists today. A permanent scar left by 1812 still sitting in the landscape in 2026. The felt area of the sequence was enormous. Church bells rang in Boston, more than 1,500 kilometers from the epicentral zone. Chimneys collapsed in Cincinnati. The ground shook in Washington, D.C. President James Madison reportedly felt the shaking in the White House. Thousands of aftershocks followed over the next 18 months. The death toll was low primarily because population density was so sparse. But here is the number that matters. The built environment of 1812 was almost nothing. Wooden frontier structures, small settlements, no major bridges, no pipelines, no hospitals, no interstate highway network. The same fault that produced that sequence sits beneath a completely different world now. The 1811 to 1812 sequence was documented. It had witnesses. It had newspaper accounts, letters, journals, government records. But what happened before 1811? What was the fault doing in the centuries and millennia before European settlement, before written records, before anyone was keeping track? That question belongs to a field called paleoseismology, and the answers it has produced are among the most important and most unsettling findings in the entire scientific literature on the New Madrid seismic zone. Paleoseismology is the study of prehistoric earthquakes using physical evidence preserved in sediment. When a large earthquake shakes saturated ground, it leaves marks. The most important of these, in the Mississippi embayment, are sand blows. A sand blow forms when violent shaking causes water-saturated sand layers below the surface to suddenly lose their structural integrity and behave like a liquid, a process called liquefaction. The fluidized sand is then forced upward through overlying sediment layers, erupting at the surface as a vent or a spreading sheet of sandy material. Sand blows can be meters wide and can preserve a record of the shaking event for thousands of years if burial conditions are right. But here's the detail that everyone missed at the time, at least until researchers began systematically excavating the Mississippi embayment in the late 20th century. The landscape is covered in them. Buried sand blows, stacked in layers, separated by soil horizons that represent centuries of quiet between events. Each sandblow layer is a timestamp. Each one records that a very large earthquake happened here and the ground liquefied, and this is what it left behind. USGS-funded trench studies, conducted at multiple sites across the zone over several decades, have identified at least 5 major rupture events in the last 4,500 years. 5 sequences, each apparently comparable in scale to 1811 and 1812, each leaving a stratigraphy of liquefaction features that researchers can date using radiocarbon methods. The dates cluster. The events are not random. They appear to recur. The estimated recurrence interval derived from this paleoseismic record is 400 to 500 years between major sequences. The 1811 to 1812 sequence was the most recent. That means the new Madrid seismic zone is now approximately 214 years into its next cycle. If the 400 to 500 year recurrence estimate is correct, the zone is somewhere between roughly 40 and 60% of the way through the interval before the next major sequence. That framing requires an immediate and important qualification, because this is where the science demands precision and the media almost always fails to deliver it. The geological record is not a clock. Recurrence intervals derived from paleoseismology are statistical estimates with wide uncertainty ranges. The 5 events identified in the last 4,500 years give an average interval, but the gaps between individual events vary. Some intervals may have been 200 years. Some may have been closer to 1,000 years. The sample size is small. The dating uncertainties on individual events can span decades. Researchers, including those at the University of Memphis Center for Earthquake Research and Information, which has maintained continuous seismic monitoring of the zone since 1977, have been explicit about this. The recurrence data tells you that major sequences happen. It does not tell you when the next one will happen with any precision that would be useful for short-term planning. What the paleoseismic record does establish, beyond reasonable scientific dispute, is that the 1811 to 1812 sequence was not an anomaly. It was not a once-in-geological history event. It was one instance in a repeating pattern that extends back at least 4,500 years, and almost certainly much further. The fault has done this before, multiple times, with no human witnesses, with no instruments, with nothing but sand and sediment to record that the ground tore itself apart and then went quiet again and waited. The recurrence interval of 400 to 500 years also means something specific about the present moment. The zone is not in the early stages of its cycle. It is not freshly reset. It is mid-cycle, by the best available estimate, accumulating strain, producing background seismicity, and doing exactly what the paleoseismic record suggests it does in the centuries before a major sequence. Whether that means anything for 2026, or 2050, or 2150, no scientist can honestly say. But the question of whether the zone is capable of another 1811 scale sequence is not a question. The answer is yes. It has always been yes. The paleoseismic record settled that question decades ago. The instruments do not lie. And what they recorded in the first half of 2026 was a fault system that had become measurably more active. On March 5, 2026, a 7-earthquake mini-swarm was reported in southern Missouri along the New Madrid Fault. The events were small, mostly below magnitude 2.0, but they clustered tightly in time and space, in a pattern consistent with stress redistribution along one of the zone's primary fault segments. The USGS National Earthquake Information Center logged them. Regional seismologists noted them. The local news cycle picked them up briefly and then moved on. The same background seismicity that built the scientific community's understanding of New Madrid's behavior was about to become the center of a much larger conversation about what the zone is actually capable of, and what happens when 12 million people live on top of it. On April 22, 2026, a magnitude 4.0 main shock struck southeast Missouri. This one was widely felt. People in Cape Girardeau, Sikeston, and surrounding communities reported shaking strong enough to rattle windows and wake sleeping residents. The USGS issued a standard felt earthquake notification. Regional media ran brief reports. Scientists at the University of Memphis Center for Earthquake Research and Information cross-referenced the event against the zone's background seismicity record and noted that the April event was among the stronger felt earthquakes in the region in several years. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did, not loudly enough, not with enough context for the public to understand what they were actually looking at. Then came June 14, 2026. The same monitoring infrastructure that had quietly logged hundreds of micro-earthquakes every year was about to be tested at a different scale. This decision seemed small at the time. It wasn't. The choice to treat each individual swarm event as routine, rather than communicating the cumulative pattern to the public, would define how 12 million people understood their own risk. At least 8 earthquakes in approximately 24 hours. The USGS confirmed the swarm pattern. The events were distributed along a segment of the new Madrid seismic zone in southern Missouri, consistent with the fault geometry that has characterized the zone's background seismicity for decades. The largest events in the swarm were small enough that most residents felt nothing. But the pattern, 8 events in a single day following a 7-event cluster in March and a magnitude 4.0 in April, was enough to generate significant attention from both the scientific community and the public. The same fault system that produced the most powerful earthquake sequence in the recorded history of the contiguous United States was about to remind everyone that it had not finished. The same intraplate architecture that amplifies seismic waves across 10 times the area of a California quake was still operating beneath every bridge, pipeline, and hospital in the Mississippi corridor. The same liquefaction-prone sediments that swallowed the built environment of 1812 lie directly beneath the built environment of 2026. Here is what a swarm actually is, because the word carries implications that the science does not always support. An earthquake swarm is a cluster of seismic events that are close in time and space, with no single dominant main shock. Swarms are distinct from a main shock aftershock sequence, where one large event is followed by progressively smaller ones. In a swarm, the events are roughly comparable in size, and the sequence can continue for days, weeks, or even months. Swarms reflect stress redistribution within a fault system. They are common in volcanically active regions, in geothermal areas, and in fault systems with complex geometry. The new Madrid seismic zone has produced swarms periodically throughout the instrumental record. The critical scientific question about any swarm is whether it represents a foreshock sequence, a cluster of small events that precedes a larger main shock. The honest answer, as of current seismological understanding, is that there is no reliable method to distinguish a foreshock sequence from a swarm that simply dissipates on its own until after the fact. The statistical tools exist to calculate probabilities, and the USGS does publish operational earthquake forecasts that update in near real time following significant seismic activity. But the base rate probability of a swarm being followed by a large main shock is low, and the uncertainty is high. USGS seismologist Joan Gomberg has cautioned publicly against over-interpreting short-term fluctuations in background seismicity. The new Madrid seismic zone produces hundreds of micro-earthquakes every year. Clusters occur regularly. The presence of a swarm does not, by itself, indicate that a major event is imminent. That is not a reassuring statement. It is a precise one. The science does not support panic. It also does not support dismissal. And this is the part where things stopped being simple. The 2026 swarm activity did not occur in a monitoring vacuum. It was captured by one of the most sophisticated seismic networks ever deployed in the central United States. A system that has been quietly expanding its capabilities for decades, while the public remained largely unaware it existed. The USGS Advanced National Seismic System, known as ANSS, operates a dense network of broadband seismometers across the central United States. These are not the crude instruments of the early 20th century. Modern broadband seismometers can detect ground motion across a wide range of frequencies, from the slow, long-period waves generated by distant large earthquakes to the high-frequency shaking of nearby small events. The data streams continuously to the National Earthquake Information Center in Golden, Colorado, where automated detection algorithms and human analysts process incoming seismic signals around the clock. When the June 14 swarm events occurred, they were detected, located, and cataloged within minutes. The system worked exactly as designed. The Central United States Earthquake Consortium, known as CUSEC, operates at a different layer of the response architecture. CUSEC is a multi-state coordination body that tracks seismic hazard and preparedness across 8 states in the central U.S. It functions as the institutional bridge between the scientific community, which produces hazard assessments and monitoring data, and the emergency management agencies, which are responsible for planning and response. CUSC's published guidance has stated for decades that the New Madrid seismic zone is capable of producing damaging earthquakes at any time. That language has not changed since the 1990s. It is not alarmist. It is the consensus scientific position. GPS geodetic networks add another layer of monitoring capability that most people do not know exists. A network of continuously operating GPS receivers is distributed across the New Madrid region, measuring ground position with millimeter-scale precision. These instruments are looking for something specific, any acceleration in the rate of ground deformation that might indicate a change in the stress loading of the fault system. Tectonic strain accumulation is slow, millimeters per year, but if that rate were to change, if the ground began moving faster or in a different direction, it would be a significant signal. As of the most recent published geodetic analyses, the deformation field in the New Madrid region remains consistent with long-term background rates. No acceleration has been detected. That is an important data point, but it is not a guarantee of anything. Liquefaction susceptibility maps represent another critical monitoring and planning tool. The Mississippi embayment is underlain by thick sequences of water-saturated alluvial sediment, the accumulated deposits of the Mississippi River system over millions of years. These sediments are highly susceptible to liquefaction during strong shaking. They also amplify seismic waves, meaning that the shaking at the surface can be significantly stronger than the shaking at the bedrock level where the energy originates. USGS and state geological surveys have produced detailed maps of liquefaction susceptibility across the zone, updated as new boring data and geotechnical information becomes available. These maps are used by engineers, planners, and emergency managers to identify the areas of highest risk. The highest risk areas are, predictably, the flat alluvial floodplains closest to the Mississippi and its tributaries, which are also the areas with the highest population density and the most critical infrastructure. Here is the problem. Shake alert, the earthquake early warning system that provides seconds to tens of seconds of warning before strong shaking arrives, is operational on the west coast of the United States. It covers California, Oregon, and Washington. It has already issued warnings for real earthquakes. People have received alerts on their phones. The system works. Shake alert is not deployed in the central United States. The New Madrid seismic zone, home to 12 million people, sitting on top of a fault system with a documented history of magnitude 7 and 8 earthquakes, has no early warning system. Scientists have flagged this gap repeatedly. The USGS has acknowledged it. The funding and political will to extend the network eastward have not materialized at the scale required. The practical consequence of this gap is significant. On the West Coast, a magnitude 7.0 earthquake might generate 30 to 60 seconds of warning for communities 100 kilometers from the epicenter. That is enough time for automated systems to slow trains, for surgeons to step back from operating tables, for people to move away from windows. In the New Madrid region, the first warning most people would receive is the shaking itself. The P wave, the faster, less damaging compressional wave, arrives first. The S wave and surface waves, which carry most of the destructive energy, arrive seconds later. Without an early warning system, those seconds are lost. The monitoring architecture that exists is genuinely impressive. The ANSS network, CUSEC's coordination framework, the GPS geodetic arrays, the liquefaction mapping programs. These represent decades of scientific investment and institutional commitment. But the gap in early warning coverage is real. It is documented. And it means that when the New Madrid seismic zone produces its next major event, 12 million people will have no advance notice at all. Here is what is not making headlines. The numbers, when you stack them, are staggering. 15 major bridges cross the Mississippi and Ohio rivers inside the projected damage zone. The majority were designed and built before modern seismic design codes were adopted. The Memphis and Hernando de Soto bridges over the Mississippi at Memphis, Tennessee, are among the most studied, with engineering assessments identifying significant vulnerability to the kind of long-duration, low-frequency shaking the New Madrid zone would produce. 3,500 miles of natural gas pipelines run through the zone's highest hazard corridor, supplying heating fuel and industrial energy to communities across the central and eastern United States. Pipeline infrastructure is vulnerable to ground deformation, liquefaction-induced lateral spreading, and fault rupture. 715,000 buildings damaged, 86,000 casualties. Those are the projections from FEMA's 2008 catastrophic earthquake scenario for a magnitude 7.7 New Madrid event. $300 billion in estimated economic losses from that same scenario. A figure roughly comparable to the total damage caused by Hurricane Katrina when adjusted for scale and scope. 30% of the built environment in the Mississippi floodplain rendered inaccessible within hours of a major event, according to USGS and State Geological Survey liquefaction susceptibility assessments. 12 million people inside the projected strong shaking footprint with no shake alert coverage. 214 years into a recurrence cycle estimated at 400 to 500 years. 0 early warning seconds available when the next main shock arrives. Those are not projections from advocacy groups. They are the current operating numbers at FEMA, the USGS, and the Central United States Earthquake Consortium. The 2008 FEMA scenario also projected that response operations would be severely hampered by the loss of transportation infrastructure. If the bridges are down and the roads are impassable, how do you move emergency personnel and supplies into the affected area? The answer, in the scenario's modeling, was that you cannot do it quickly. The response timeline for a New Madrid catastrophic event was projected to be significantly longer and more difficult than the response to any previous American natural disaster. Joan Gomberg, a USGS earthquake seismologist who has spent significant portions of her career studying the New Madrid seismic zone, has been one of the most consistent voices of calibrated scientific communication on this topic. Her public statements following the 2026 swarm activity were precise. Short-term fluctuations in background seismicity should not be interpreted as predictive of an imminent large event. Swarms happen. Background seismicity varies. Capturing data and predicting earthquakes are not the same thing. Gomberg's caution is not dismissiveness. It is scientific integrity. There's a reason this story is still talked about today. It is not because the 2026 swarms were dramatic. It is because the gap they exposed between what scientists know and what the public understands has existed for decades, quietly, while 12 million people went about their lives on top of a fault that has already done this before. The USGS Earthquake Hazards Program formally maintains the 25 to 40% probability estimate for a magnitude 6.0 or greater event in the New Madrid seismic zone within any 50-year window. This estimate is published in peer-reviewed hazard assessments and updated as new data becomes available. It is not a guess. It is a probabilistic statement derived from the paleoseismic record, the instrumental seismicity catalog, and geodetic strain measurements. A 25 to 40% probability over 50 years means that in any given year, the probability of a magnitude 6.0 or greater event is roughly 0.5 to 0.8%. That sounds small, but it is orders of magnitude higher than the background probability for most of the eastern United States. And it applies to a fault system that has already demonstrated the capacity to produce events far larger than magnitude 6.0. That is the kind of number that makes accountants cry, especially when the infrastructure exposure runs to $300 billion. CUSC's published guidance states that the New Madrid seismic zone is capable of producing damaging earthquakes at any time. That language, unchanged since the 1990s, reflects the scientific consensus with unusual directness. There is no hedging. There is no reassurance. The zone is capable, at any time. Michael Pollan, the USGS scientist in charge of Yellowstone volcano monitoring, has described the institutional framework for communicating swarm events without triggering unwarranted public panic. The Yellowstone caldera produces swarms regularly. The USGS has developed communication protocols that provide factual information, context, and probability assessments without either minimizing the hazard or amplifying public fear beyond what the science supports. Poland has explicitly described this framework as applicable to other seismic systems, including New Madrid. The challenge is identical: a fault system producing regular background activity, occasional swarms, and a non-trivial, long-term probability of a major event, in a media environment that tends toward either dismissal or catastrophism. The University of Memphis Center for Earthquake Research and Information has maintained continuous seismic monitoring of the New Madrid seismic zone since 1977. Nearly 5 decades of instrumental data. CERE's catalog is the primary scientific record of the zone's behavior in the modern era, documenting background seismicity, occasional larger felt events, swarms, and the long-term patterns that inform hazard assessment. That 1977 monitoring decision would come back to haunt the zone's public preparedness record. But that's getting ahead of the story. Picture it. February 7, 1812, New Madrid, Missouri. A boatman moored on the Mississippi bank wakes to a roaring sound, like thunder moving toward him from the southwest. He steps onto the deck. The ground beneath the bank is rolling in slow, visible waves. The air carries sulfur. The river, which has run south for as long as anyone alive has known it, is pushing his boat north against its mooring rope. Trees on the far bank snap at the root. Sand erupts from the ground in columns along the shoreline. He has no framework for what he is seeing. There is no word in his vocabulary for intraplate rupture, for liquefaction, for a real foot rift releasing 500 million years of stored strain in 90 seconds. He knows only that the river is going the wrong way, and the ground will not stop moving. The town of New Madrid still stands on that same alluvial sediment today. The sediment that leak-feed in 1812 lies directly beneath the foundations of the buildings that replaced everything the earthquake destroyed. Here are the questions. If the FEMA 2008 scenario projected 86,000 casualties from a magnitude 7.7 event, what does the casualty projection look like for a repeat of the magnitude 7.9 to 8.0 main shock that struck on February 7, 1812? Against a built environment that did not exist in 1812. If 15 major bridges across the Mississippi and Ohio rivers were rendered impassable by liquefaction and ground deformation, how long before emergency supply lines reaching Memphis, St. Louis, and Evansville could be restored? If the New Madrid seismic zone is 214 years into a recurrence cycle estimated at 400 to 500 years, and shake alert has still not been extended to cover the central United States, what is the institutional calculation that has decided those 12 million people do not need the same seconds of warning that California, Oregon, and Washington already have? Right now, beneath the Mississippi floodplain, the real foot rift is still accumulating strain. The water-saturated sediments of the Mississippi embayment are still amplifying every micro-earthquake the fault produces. The 15 bridges across the Mississippi and Ohio rivers are still carrying interstate traffic above a fault system with no early warning coverage. The New Madrid seismic zone is 214 years into its cycle. It is not sleeping.